Hi, I am Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
I confess there are cases, even among those which I have had the privilege to observe at close quarters, that press upon the nerves with a peculiar chill. It is not the spectacle of death, that sober companion of our profession, but rather the suggestion that human malice can be patient, ingenious, and as deliberate as a clock. Of such breed was the affair that the newspapers later christened "the room that waited for dawn." It was in the raw grey of an autumn morning, the lamps still burning like sickly moons along Baker Street, when Mrs. Hudson's discreet tapping preceded the swish of our sitting-room door. She stood framed in the aperture, a candle held against the draught, and behind her, improperly early for any visitor but tragedy, was Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, his narrow countenance sharpened by cold and urgency. "Mr. Holmes," he said without preface, "I've a business for you that will not keep till the sun is up." Holmes was already on his feet. He had not slept, or at least he had slept with his eyes open. The violin lay across the chair-arm like a resting bird, and the ash upon the table showed a stratified history of his meditations. He bade Lestrade come to the fire, and with that peculiar courtesy which in him masked the most rapid working of the mind, supplied him coffee and a seat before the great map of London which dominated the wall. "You have chosen an hour at which London confesses its sins," said Holmes, glancing at the damp upon Lestrade's hat-brim. "Pray give us yours." "A gentleman dead in a locked room, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade returned. "Dead with every window fast and every key accounted for, while two constables sat within arm's length of the door. And here is the crowning oddity. The deceased left written orders that no one should lay hand upon the door, no one, until daybreak." Holmes's eyes, those clear steel points, took a sudden brightness. "So the room itself waited for dawn," he murmured, almost to himself. "Continue." "The deceased is Sir Lysander Starkweather," said Lestrade, baronet of Tilbury Rise, known in the city for certain bold investments, and outside it for a charity to retired seamen. He had taken a private parlour at the Aurora Hotel, Strand, number 26, east-facing, and set about his papers at 10 o'clock last night. A waiter brought him a tray at 11 and saw him barricade himself in, saying, "Mark this, that he was not to be disturbed until the first light touched the cornice." He even wrote it down for the manager in his own hand and had it witnessed. "The paper's in my pocket." Two of my men were sent to stand by the door in case he feared interruption. They heard him moving once or twice. Shortly after midnight there was the striking of a match, and then nothing. Holmes leaned back, the fingers of one hand steepled under his chin. "And at dawn?" "At dawn," said Lestrade, and his voice, hard as it was, held a reluctant awe. "The blind flew up of its own accord, or so it seemed, and the room, begging your pardon, was full of the dead. We forced the door. Sir Lysander was at the writing desk, fallen sideways from the chair. The windows were latched from within, the chimney cold, the door key in his pocket. There's no wound to speak of. The physician on the premises says heart failure, but he also says—" He broke off and looked at me with a needle of discomfort. "You'll form your own opinion, Doctor?" Holmes's mouth made its minute, sardonic curve. "Indeed he will. What caused the blind to leap, Inspector? You heard the word flew." "A spring, perhaps. We found the cord snapped and the slat cracked clean through. There is a faint smell in the air of—well, I shall not hazard it. The manager swears that Sir Lysander himself demanded that the room be set ready at sunset, the east curtain drawn, the blind down, the desk nearer the window, and a great sheet of foolscap pinned to the wall opposite. In the grate there is no ash. On the floor dust as if from a chalk piece dashed and smeared. On the table a glass of water untouched, and, here is the oddest trifle, salt upon the sill. Salt? A sprinkling, like what you'd find on a pier after a blow. Holmes rose and went to the window. The day was still unborn. The smudge of London lay inert beneath a stubborn sky. I watched his reflection in the glass, the long, ascetic face, the hawk-beak nose that had sniffed out so much villainy, and that inward spark which could, at a word, flare to a conflagration of intellect. "You interest me, Lestrade," said he. "A room contrived to meet the day, and a man who forbids entry till the day arrives. The blind, the paper pinned opposite, the shifting of the desk, the salt, each a stroke, perhaps, upon one canvas, and he is found dead at his easel, so to speak. A canvas, Mr. Holmes? Allow me a figure," he returned. "What else have you?" Lestrade produced the written order. Holmes examined it without touching the seal. Sir Lysander's hand, firm, even strokes. He was not in terror when he wrote this. He anticipated something, desired it even, and guarded its orchestration. "The Aurora Hotel, you say? Fitting." "Fitting?" "The Dawn, Inspector, the Aurora. Names are rarely accidents in the theatre of crime. Did Sir Lysander have enemies?" Lestrade gave a short laugh, devoid of humour. "He had partners, Mr. Holmes, which in the city is a similar thing. There are rumours, shipping contracts, a dispute over wharfage on the Tilbury docks, a charity account that does not add. There is also family, a nephew disinherited, a lady from Madeira whispered about, and a former sea captain, John Bristow, who recently accused Sir Lysander in the public prints of profiting by the fog. I have their statements in my bag, but I thought it best not to choke the channel with paper before you'd seen the room." "You did well," said Holmes. He turned to me. "Watson, if you will favour me with your hat, the Aurora is a brisk 20 minutes at this hour, and the sun consults no man's convenience." As we drove, Lestrade, with the economy he practised in most things except caution, expanded upon his outline. Sir Lysander, it seemed, had been of that species of gentleman who move between the Strand's theatres and the city's counting-houses with equal assurance. A slight man of 60 years, dapper, with a trimmed white moustache and a complexion that had once belonged to the quarter-deck, he kept his domestic establishment at Tilbury Rise and a suite at the Aurora when business detained him in town. His philanthropy towards old seamen had earned him a seat at public dinners and a profile in one of the illustrated weeklies. His speculations had earned him whispers. "The waiter, name of Clegg, says Sir Lysander was in uncommon spirits last night," Lestrade remarked over the rattle of the cab. "Joked about catching the day in a net, sent away the decanter, and asked instead for water. The manager, Mr. Hargreaves, swears he tried to argue about leaving the door unattended till morning, but Sir Lysander was insistent, and the staff, well, he is a baronet, and a paying one." Holmes's gaze had gone remote in that manner I knew intimately. He seemed to study the thin ashes in the tray on his knee, but I am convinced the whole Aurora Hotel was already reflected in their grey. He shifted the desk to the window, he said softly. He arranged the blind. He pinned paper opposite. A man sets his stage. To what performance? The first light is the cue. The blind leaps. Why? A spring, say you, Inspector. And salt upon the sill. Curious. He glanced out at the river's black band. Salt where there is no sea. We found the Aurora, still in that hush which large houses keep before they wake. The porter's whiskers were frosted with the cold he had drawn in with the door. The tiled lobby held the faint ghost of last night's cigars. Mr. Hargreaves, a spare gentleman of a faded decisiveness, met us with a wringing of hands and led the way with whispers, as if the dead were a sleeper to be respected. Number 26 lay at the far end of an eastward corridor. 2 constables stood before it, faces pinched, their very boots appearing subdued. The door stood open now, and the room, when we entered, presented itself with that strange air of vacancy which clings to a scene from which the principal actor has been removed by force. It was a handsome apartment, with an oblong window that promised the sunrise Holmes had spoken of, a fireplace of decent marble, and a ceiling cornice picked out with gilded leaves. The writing desk had indeed been drawn up close to the window, as if to take dictation from the morning. The blind, broken at its lower slat, hung at a disorderly angle. Upon the wall opposite, a sheet of foolscap had been fastened with 2 brass tacks. Its surface bore nothing but a single smeared grey arc, as if some chalked instrument had dallied there and been swept across with a sleeve. Sir Lysander Starkweather sat no more. He lay upon the rug beside the desk, turned slightly upon his right with that dreadful suggestion of having merely altered position to ease a cramp. His expression was of surprise rather than suffering. I bent at once and made such examination as the moment allowed. The skin was cool, the pupils moderately dilated, the lips tinged but not markedly cyanosed. There was a faint, acrid taint to the air, which I could not instantly place. There were no marks of violence upon the body, no petechiae to suggest strangulation, no lividity that contradicted the position in which he lay. The cardiac region showed no external sign, though the hand, his right, was closed upon something brittle that flaked as I loosened the fingers. "Chalk," I said, holding up the residue. Holmes had gone to the window. "And on the sill?" he murmured. "Salt, or what passes for it." He touched it lightly and smelt it. "Not our common table companion, I think. Inspector, we will require a clean envelope for a sample." His eye ran along the frame, then to the cord of the blind, which had indeed parted close by the cleat. He crouched, and with a little exclamation of satisfaction, drew from beneath the desk a length of twine so fine and so taut that, but for the angle of the light, it would have been invisible. It ran from the blind cord pulley across the lower portion of the window to the leg of the desk, where it had been anchored by a dab of wax. "Ah," said Holmes, "our room did not merely wait, it prepared." Lestrade made a noise in his throat. Prepared for what? Holmes's glance went to the blank white sheet on the opposite wall, then to the faint arc of grey upon it. He said nothing, but his nostrils dilated minutely, and I knew the chase had already begun. Holmes straightened from the window, the faint dust still clinging to his fingertips, and turned to where I crouched beside the body. His gaze moved swiftly from the chalk dust on the rug to the note pinned upon the wall, and finally to the broken blind, as though he were reading a page already half known to him. "Watson," said he quietly, "you observed the position of the body before it was disturbed?" "I did. He appears to have collapsed forward from the chair, as though seized suddenly by syncope. There are no signs of struggle, nor any evident trauma. His pulse would have stopped near midnight, I should think, though the physician might confirm that." Holmes nodded slightly. "And the chalk?" "Perhaps he was drawing something upon that sheet. A diagram or calculation interrupted." "Ah," said Holmes, "an interrupted intention, one of the most eloquent of silences." He stepped lightly across the carpet, careful not to tread upon the faint arc of dust near the wall, and examined the foolscap. From his pocket he produced a small magnifying lens, and I watched him study the faint smear with the absorption of a man reading scripture. "Not chalk," he murmured at last. "Plaster, powdered, mixed with something oily. The texture is too smooth for chalk alone, and the arc is consistent with the sweep of a pendulum, not a hand." Lestrade frowned. "A pendulum, Mr. Holmes? Are we building clocks now?" Holmes's eyes flicked toward the broken blind cord and the fine twine stretched beneath the desk. On the contrary, Inspector, I believe one was already built, or at least improvised. Observe, the twine connects the blind pulley to the leg of the desk. A weight could have been suspended from it, something small, perhaps a metal rod or tube. When the cord was cut or the spring released, the weight would swing. It might have struck the wall at precisely that height, hence our arc of plaster. Lestrade blinked. But to what purpose? That, said Holmes, we shall discover when we know what substance lies upon that sill. He collected the crystalline dust into the envelope and held it to the light. Salt, yes, but not of the sea. Potassium nitrate and magnesium oxide, I think. A chemist could confirm it. Mixed in proper proportion, it yields a flash of intense white light, the kind that might illuminate a dark room for an instant, or catch the eye of a man waiting for dawn. I shuddered slightly. You suggest Sir Lysander was waiting for a light of his own making. Or for another's, Holmes replied. The window faces east, yet the blind was drawn. He intended that no natural light disturb him until the mechanism fulfilled its role. He constructed a false dawn and died at its appearance. The inspector made a sceptical grunt. A gentleman, playing at fireworks indoors, then dropping dead of fright? Holmes gave a faint smile. Would you be content with that, Lestrade? I've been content with stranger. Holmes ignored him and crouched again by the corpse. From Sir Lysander's breast pocket he drew a small silver case tarnished at the hinge. It contained 2 visiting cards and a folded note in fine feminine handwriting. He unfolded it with delicate fingers. If it must be so, then wait for the first light. You shall see the truth written plainly. M. Holmes's eyebrows rose a fraction. M, he said softly. We have a ghost in the alphabet, Inspector. Tell me, does one of Sir Lysander's acquaintances answer to that initial? Lestrade scratched his head. There's a Miss Margaret Vale, a niece by marriage, and a Mrs. Melina Starkweather, deceased these 3 years. There's also a Madeira connection, as I said earlier, a Mrs. Martha Delane, widow of Captain Delane. She's in London now. Indeed, Holmes murmured. Then perhaps our dawn awaits her too. He turned back to the writing desk. Upon it lay several items neatly arranged, a ledger, a fountain pen, a small ivory compass, and an envelope sealed with dark wax, bearing the impression of a ship's wheel. Holmes broke the seal and spread the contents. It was a single sheet of heavy paper with a column of figures, coordinates by the look of them, and beneath a single sentence scrawled in haste. The sea keeps its accounts better than men. Holmes studied it for some time. Watson, note that phrase. It may prove the tide mark of this entire affair. Lestrade shifted impatiently. You've a fine talent for poetry, Mr. Holmes, but where does that leave us? The man's dead of natural causes, by all appearance. The doctor will sign his certificate, and the newspapers will print another mystery that isn't one. Holmes replaced the paper. If it comforts you to think so, Inspector, by all means. Yet I would caution against haste. The body is silent, yes, but the room... the room speaks, and it tells me this was no natural passing. Something artificial, unseen, moved here in the hour before dawn. He leaned over the glass of water upon the desk. It remained clear and untouched, but his eyes narrowed. Do you perceive a faint film upon the surface, Watson? I looked closely. Yes, a thin residue, like oil. Precisely, and the odour in the room, the acrid taint you mentioned, is that of magnesium after ignition. It lingers when the flash has passed. Sir Lysander breathed it perhaps too deeply. Lestrade snorted. A puff of light and a heart attack. Hardly murder. Holmes smiled thinly. unless someone knew his heart would fail at the sight. Imagine, Inspector, arranging such a spectacle, a phantom dawn to strike terror or revelation into a man already frail. The mechanism acts, the blind flies, the light flares, and our baronet falls dead. The hand that set the string may be miles away, or even resting in this very hotel. He turned suddenly to the manager, who had been hovering pale and silent near the door. Mr. Hargreaves, who had access to this room before last night? No one, sir. Only the maid, Agnes Weller, who dusted it after luncheon. Sir Lysander himself oversaw the arrangement, moved the desk with his own hands, had her fetch the paper and pins, and dismissed her directly after. Did she remark anything unusual? The manager hesitated. Only that he hummed to himself, a sea song, she said. Something about the bell at dawn. Holmes's eyes gleamed. A bell at dawn, a false sunrise, and a letter from M. There is music in this pattern, Watson. Discordant still, but music none the less. Inspector, you will oblige me by holding the room secure. Touch nothing further. I shall return before evening with certain instruments, and perhaps a visitor. Lestrade's brows drew together. A visitor? Mrs. Martha Delane, if she can be persuaded, Holmes replied. For I suspect, gentlemen, that the true illumination of this affair will not come from the sun at all, but from the shadow it throws behind her name. And with that he gathered his hat and gloves, cast one last searching glance at the dead man's calm, astonished face, and strode from the room, the echo of his step as measured as the ticking of a clock awaiting its next stroke. Holmes walked briskly through the mist-veiled Strand, his long stride cutting through the morning chill as though it were mere air. I followed close behind, the damp clinging to my coat, and the weight of the scene we had just left pressing heavily upon my thoughts. I could tell from the gleam in Holmes's eyes that the machinery of his mind had already leapt several steps ahead, even as my own was still wrestling with the plain facts, the locked room, the blind, the faint salt, and that eerie command to wait for dawn. Holmes, I said at last, breaking the silence, you think Sir Lysander's death was not merely an accident brought about by fright or ill health? He gave a slight, humourless chuckle. My dear Watson, accidents are rarely so theatrical. Consider the stagecraft, an east-facing window, a mechanical contrivance that awakens precisely at sunrise, a note of warning couched in poetry, and the careful preparation of the room. Do you imagine such arrangements were made merely for him to die of his own volition? Then you believe another hand guided him to his death? Holmes drew deeply upon his pipe before answering, the smoke curling faintly in the damp air. I believe, Watson, that Sir Lysander was drawn, perhaps even lured, into constructing his own execution chamber. What better disguise for murder than the semblance of obedience to one's own orders? I fell silent. The notion chilled me far more than the morning fog. When we reached Baker Street, Holmes wasted no time. He cast aside his coat and was at the chemical table almost before I had hung mine. Bottles, powders, and a dozen small tools were spread before him in quick succession. From his pocket he drew the envelope containing the salt-like substance from the window-sill, emptied a portion onto a glass slide, and began his tests with the precision of a surgeon. The proportions are unmistakable, he said presently. Potassium nitrate, magnesium oxide, and a trace of powdered sulphur. When ignited, the mixture would produce a brilliant white flare, enough to momentarily blind or daze any observer. If our unfortunate baronet were staring directly toward that window, and if his heart were already weakened, well, the rest writes itself. So the flash killed him? Indirectly. The flash was the trigger, but not the weapon. Imagine a man haunted by guilt or expectation. A single, blinding revelation, literal and figurative, could be the instrument of his undoing. Yet we must ask who desired that undoing. He turned to the table once more, examining the slip of paper bearing the coordinates found among Sir Lysander's effects. Coordinates are a language of precision, Watson. The sea keeps its accounts better than men. An interesting phrase. These figures place us near the Thames estuary off Tilbury, close to the remnants of the old moorings Sir Lysander owned. Perhaps the sea has something to say after all. Before I could respond, there came a rap at the door, sharp and deliberate. Mrs. Hudson entered with a card upon a tray. Holmes took it and raised an eyebrow. "Ah," said he, "our guest arrives sooner than expected. Martha Delane." He motioned for her to be shown up. Moments later, a woman of striking presence entered the room. She was perhaps in her early 40s, her complexion fair, but touched with the faint bronze of southern suns, her mourning dress severe yet elegant. Her eyes, dark, intelligent, and restless, moved swiftly between Holmes and myself before settling on the detective. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her accent faintly Mediterranean, "Inspector Lestrade informed me you requested my presence concerning the death of Sir Lysander Starkweather." Holmes inclined his head. "I am grateful you came, Mrs. Delane. Please take a seat." "You were acquainted with Sir Lysander?" "I was once acquainted, yes," she replied, her tone measured. "My late husband, Captain Edward Delane, served under his patronage in the Tilbury Shipping Consortium. After my husband's passing, Sir Lysander continued certain business arrangements on my behalf, but of late I had withdrawn from his circle." Holmes leaned forward, fingers steepled. "Withdrawn? May I ask why?" Her gaze hardened slightly. "Because I discovered that his generosity was poisoned. He had invested my husband's pension into ventures he knew would fail to cover his own debts. When I threatened exposure, he begged for time. He sent me letters. Please promise his lies. The last one arrived 3 days ago. He asked me to forgive him, to meet him at dawn, so that, in his words, the truth might redeem us both." Holmes's eyes flickered, but his voice remained level. "Did you meet him?" She shook her head. "No, I tore up the letter. I wanted nothing more to do with him." "Yet you signed your earlier note to him, M, did you not?" At this her composure faltered. Yes, I wrote that some weeks ago when I still hoped he would make amends, but how did you—" "Your handwriting, madam," Holmes said softly, "is singular in its forward slant. It matches the letter found upon Sir Lysander's desk. You told him to wait for the first light, that he would see the truth written plainly." Her gloved hands trembled slightly. "Then he truly is dead?" "I regret to say so." For a long moment she said nothing. Then, in a voice scarcely above a whisper, "He was a proud man. He once said that if the sea could speak, it would accuse him louder than any living soul." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "And perhaps it has." He rose and took up his coat again. "Watson, we leave for Tilbury at once. Mrs. Delane, if you would be so good as to accompany us, I believe the answers you seek, and those I require, lie where the Thames meets the tide." She hesitated. "You think the sea can still tell you something?" "Madam," Holmes replied, his tone almost reverent, "the sea forgets nothing. It only waits to be read." Within the hour we were aboard the train, the grey landscape rushing past as London's smoke gave way to the open marshes. Mrs. Delane sat opposite us, silent and pale, while Holmes, his eyes half closed, appeared to doze. Yet I could see his fingers twitching in that unconscious rhythm that always betrayed the rapid spinning of his thoughts. When at last we reached Tilbury, the tide was ebbing. The air held that peculiar briny tang which clings to old docks and forgotten ships. In the distance, skeletal cranes loomed like sentinels of some drowned empire. Holmes paused at the edge of the quay, scanning the horizon where the faint sun burned through the fog. "There," he said quietly, pointing toward a derelict warehouse whose signboard hung askew. "The coordinates lead us to that building. Let us see if Sir Lysander's conscience, or his killer, left anything else to be found." And with that, we stepped from the light into the deepening shadows of Tilbury's silent docks, the echo of our footsteps mingling with the distant cry of gulls and the whisper of the tide withdrawing into its secrets. The wind that came off the river was damp and raw, curling about us as we made our way along the rotting planks of the Tilbury quay. The sky had sunk into a dull pewter, the faint sun veiled behind a sheet of haze that made the whole landscape seem arrested in half-light. Ahead loomed the warehouse Holmes had pointed out, an enormous structure of decaying timber and rusted iron, its windows opaque with grime, and its signboard, Starkweather and Co. Shipping, hanging askew like a relic of an empire that had outlived its captain. Mrs. Delane clutched her cloak tighter, her face pale against the chill. "This place has been deserted since the consortium collapsed," she murmured. "After my husband's death, the last ships were sold and the workers dismissed. Sir Lysander said he meant to rebuild it, but nothing ever came of it. Yet he marked this spot in his final message," Holmes replied, his voice low but firm. "A dying man seldom wastes his ink." The great doors of the warehouse resisted at first, then yielded with a groan that seemed almost human. Inside, the air was close and laden with the musty odour of salt, hemp, and old wood. Shafts of light fell through gaps in the boarded windows, catching the motes that hung like suspended time. The echo of our footsteps stretched away into the gloom. Holmes's lantern beams swept across the vast floor. Empty crates, coils of rope, and a few toppled. Barrels remained, ghosts of a trade long past. Then at the far end, his light fixed upon a smaller inner chamber, a partitioned office whose glass panes were clouded by dust. "There," he said, "the heart of the place." He crossed swiftly, his stride silent on the boards. Inside the office, the remnants of a desk stood beneath a tattered chart of sea routes, and on the wall opposite hung a brass-framed instrument, half barometer, half compass, its glass cracked, its needle trembling faintly in the draught. Holmes examined it with interest, then motioned for my assistance in moving aside a cabinet that stood slightly ajar. Behind it, nailed into the wall, was a square panel of iron about 2 feet across, discoloured by corrosion. "Observe the bolts, Watson," he said. "Too new for the rest of the room. Someone fitted this recently." He drew out his knife and pried at the edge. The panel came loose with a screech of old metal, revealing a recess within the wall. Inside lay a small chest, oak-bound and braced with tarnished brass, the lock broken cleanly as though forced by some determined hand. Holmes lifted the lid with care. Within, wrapped in oilcloth, were 3 ledgers and a series of folded documents tied with red string. "Sir Lysander's private records," murmured Holmes, "unfiled, unsurrendered, and, I imagine, unread by the auditors of his conscience." He spread the ledgers across the desk and leafed through the brittle pages. Lines of figures ran down in neat columns, but certain entries were underlined in red ink, shipments labelled Orpheus, Morning Star, and Belladonna. Each had corresponding dates and a final annotation: "Returned, account closed." "Returned?" I said, puzzled. Were they lost at sea and later found? Or never sailed at all? Holmes replied. See here, the coordinates match those on the paper from the Aurora. Sir Lysander kept his accounts as a mariner might keep a confession, always at the edge of the tide. These figures, these phantom voyages, are no mere bookkeeping error. They are the measure of something darker. Mrs. Delane had drawn near, her voice trembling. He told me once, she whispered, that certain ships had to vanish to balance the books, that they were only ghosts upon the water. I thought it was his guilty fancy. Holmes looked up sharply. Not fancy, madam, fraud. He may have insured ships that did not exist or staged their loss to reclaim their value. But the sea, as he said, keeps its accounts better than men. Such deception cannot be drowned forever. Someone discovered the truth and used it to destroy him. Before I could speak, Holmes's head tilted slightly, his expression tightening. "Do you hear it?" he said softly. I strained my ears. From somewhere behind the warehouse came the faintest creak, a floorboard protesting under weight. Holmes extinguished the lantern at once, plunging us into shadow. We waited, breath held. A moment later, a sliver of light flickered through the crack beneath the main door, followed by the soft rasp of a shoe upon grit. Without a word, Holmes slipped toward the entry, moving with feline silence. I felt Mrs. Delane's hand tighten on my arm. The door eased open just enough for the fog to curl in, and a dark figure entered, lantern in hand. The beam cut across the floor and rose to the broken cabinet, then froze upon the open chest. The intruder stiffened, but before he could turn, Holmes was upon him, seizing the lantern from his grasp and casting it aside with a crash. A brief struggle ensued, ending with the man pressed against the wall, Holmes's forearm at his throat. The light from the fallen lantern still flickered on the floor, revealing a narrow, pinched face beneath a workman's cap. "Inspector Lestrade!" I exclaimed. Lestrade, red-faced and gasping, managed to wrench free. "Confound it, Holmes! You near broke my collarbone. You might have warned a man." Holmes's tone cooled at once. "Then I take it you were not sent by our adversary, but by your own curiosity. What brings Scotland Yard creeping about warehouses at dawn?" "I followed you," Lestrade admitted, rubbing his neck. "Couldn't let you run off with half the evidence in London. You said not to touch the room at the Aurora, and I didn't. But I've got a man watching the telegraph office. A wire came through not half an hour after you left, addressed to Sir Lysander's clerk, signed with the same initial, M. I thought it best to find you before you vanished into the fog." Holmes's eyes flashed. "A telegram, you say? What did it contain?" Lestrade unfolded a slip of paper. "The dawn has passed. The debt is settled. Destroy all copies." "That's all." Mrs. Delane gasped. "But I sent no message." Holmes regarded her steadily. "Then someone signs in your name, madam, and wishes the world to think your quarrel with Sir Lysander is concluded. Tell me, Inspector, where was the telegram sent from?" Lestrade checked his notes. "From the Tilbury office, barely a mile from here." Holmes's expression hardened. "Then our enemy walks close at our heels. Watson, the game quickens. This message was not intended merely to erase the trail. It was meant to lure us here where another dawn awaits." Even as he spoke, the wind rose sharply, slamming the half-open door against its hinges. Somewhere in the rafters above, a length of chain stirred with a hollow clank, and I thought, though it might have been imagination, that a faint scent of salt drifted through the air again. Holmes turned toward the darkness beyond the office, his eyes bright with that keen glimmer I had come to recognize before every revelation. "Stay close," he murmured. "The sea may keep its secrets, Watson. But tonight, I intend to make it speak." The sound of the wind through the rafters deepened, carrying with it the soft lap of the tide against the pilings below. The vast emptiness of the warehouse seemed to breathe around us, the lantern's glow trembling upon warped beams and the skeletal outlines of forgotten crates. Holmes stood perfectly still, his head inclined as though listening to something far subtler than the wind. A rhythm, perhaps, or a pulse buried in the silence itself. "Watson," he murmured, "do you perceive it, the faint metallic note beneath the draft?" I listened, straining my ears. At first there was nothing, and then a soft, intermittent clink, like chains striking against metal, coming from beneath the floorboards. Lestrade lifted the lantern, its light quivering along the cracks between planks. "There's a cellar here," Holmes said quietly. "Likely an old storage vault for spirits or tar. Whatever waits below has stirred recently. See how the dust along the trapdoor hinge is disturbed." He knelt, fingers finding the iron ring that lay flush with the boards, and pulled. The door rose with a long groan of rusted hinges, exhaling a cold, damp breath from the darkness below. The scent that rose was unmistakable, the heavy tang of the river, laced with decay and salt. Holmes took the lantern from Lestrade and descended first, his figure vanishing into the gloom. I followed, Mrs. Delane and Lestrade close behind. The steps ended in a narrow corridor lined with brick, the walls slick with moisture. At the far end lay a low, arched chamber, half cellar, half crypt. Water gleamed upon the floor, pooled in dark patches, and the sound of the river's pulse echoed faintly through the stone. In the centre of the chamber stood a heavy iron table, its surface pitted with corrosion, and upon it what at first I took for a sailor's chest proved, on closer inspection, to be a strong box with a shattered lock. Scattered about it were sheets of damp paper, some stamped with seals, others bearing smudged figures. Holmes examined them in silence. "Insurance manifests," he said at length, bearing the mark of Starkweather & Co., all cancelled, all dated in the year following Captain Delane's death. Our baronet, it seems, insured ships that never sailed and collected on their ruin. Yet one record differs. See this, Watson. Ship Orpheus declared lost, Tilbury Docks, dawn tide. Dawn again. The same motif, recurring like a refrain. Sir Lysander lived by it, died by it, and left it as a signature upon his crimes. Mrs. Delane's voice, though soft, trembled. "And you think my husband's death is bound to this?" Holmes looked up at her with rare gentleness. "I think, madam, your husband discovered too much. The Orpheus was never lost, it was concealed. Somewhere beneath these waters, or near them, lies the evidence that condemned Sir Lysander to fear the very sunrise." As if in answer, there came another sound from beyond the cellar wall, a slow creak, deliberate and heavy, followed by the muffled splash of something dropped into water. Lestrade's hand went to his revolver. "We're not alone down here," he whispered. Holmes extinguished the lantern at once. "Silence," he breathed. "Let the darkness tell its story." We waited. Through the stillness came the faint rhythm again, metal scraping stone, the hollow thud of boots on planks, and then retreating footsteps ascending above. A door slammed distantly, followed by the fading echo of hurried movement along the dock outside. Holmes rekindled the lantern, his eyes alive with fierce intelligence. "Our quarry departs, Inspector, but he has shown his hand. He knew of this vault and what it held. Whatever he cast into the water was meant to vanish, as Sir Lysander's ships once did. Come, we must not lose the scent." We ascended swiftly. Outside, the fog had thickened into a wall, swallowing the wharf and dimming even the nearest lamp. The air tasted of brine and soot. Holmes's gaze swept the ground. His keen eye caught a fresh mark in the grime, a boot print smudged with oil and clay. "Recent," he said. The heel cut shallow, city make, not dockside. Whoever he is, he's no labourer. This way." We followed as he traced the prints along the edge of the quay, where the tide licked hungrily at the stone. After a short distance, they veered toward a smaller pier where an old rowing skiff was moored. The rope still swung, dripping. The oars were wet. Holmes crouched and examined the seat. "Our man departed scarcely 2 minutes ago. Note the grain, disturbed but not dried." He straightened, scanning the dark water. "He heads for the lower inlet, where the river bends. If I am not mistaken, that is where the Orpheus lies." Lestrade frowned. "You mean the wreck? You think he's gone to it?" Holmes smiled faintly. "To what remains of it, yes. There are debts the living must still pay, even to the drowned." He turned to Mrs. Delane. "Madam, you must return to the carriage and wait. This pursuit may prove dangerous." She shook her head firmly. "No, Mr. Holmes. My husband's death began here. I will see where it ends." There was no time for argument. Holmes motioned to a second skiff drawn up beside the pier. "Then we follow. Watson, take the lantern under your coat. Shield the light until we near the bend." The river was a black mirror as we rowed, the oars dipping soundlessly beneath the mist. The outline of Tilbury faded behind us, replaced by the spectral shapes of pilings and half-submerged hulls. Now and again, the water gurgled where it met the bank, and once I thought I saw the shadow of another craft ahead, low, moving steadily through the fog. Holmes's arm brushed mine as he leaned forward, his eyes fixed ahead. "There," he whispered. "Do you see that faint glow? He's using a lantern with a shutter." We closed the distance, slowly, soundlessly. Presently, the faint glimmer vanished, and when we reached the place it had been, the current stilled. Holmes gestured for silence, then lowered a hand into the water. When he withdrew it, his fingers gleamed faintly with oil. "He's here," he murmured, "and so is the Orpheus." The fog thinned for a moment, revealing the outline of a half-sunken ship, its ribs jutting from the tide like the bones of some leviathan. The name upon its stern was barely legible, but the letters Orpheus could still be discerned beneath a crust of algae. Holmes's expression hardened. "It is as I suspected. The ship was never lost at sea. It was scuttled here, at the very heart of Sir Lysander's dominion, to hide what he could not burn." He reached over the gunwale, gripping the edge of the wreck. "Watson, Lestrade, tie off the skiff. We're going aboard." We clambered over the tilted deck, the planks soft with rot, and the air thick with the smell of rust and riverweed. In the lantern's glow, something metallic gleamed among the wreckage, a chain, still wet, leading into an open hatch. Holmes stooped, touched the links, and held his fingers to his nose. "Salt and gunpowder," he said. He meant to destroy what remained, but was interrupted. "We have arrived in time, though only just." From below came a faint sound, footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the hollow hull. Holmes drew a deep breath, the faintest smile touching his lips. "Come, Watson," he whispered. "The play is nearing its climax, and I rather think the curtain will rise before the dawn once more." The sound that rose from below the shattered deck was unlike anything human. It was too slow, too deliberate, as though the hull itself remembered footsteps that had once trod there and was now repeating them in echo. The four of us stood motionless, listening. A single droplet of water fell from the beams above and struck the surface near Holmes's boot with a faint hiss. Then, as if in answer, a faint metallic clatter came again from the open hatchway leading into the ship's hold. Holmes gestured for silence, his hand a shadow against the misted light of the lantern. He descended first, his tall figure disappearing into the narrow passage, and I followed close behind, my nerves taut with that peculiar tension that sits between dread and fascination. The air below was stifling, thick with the stagnant odor of oil, brine, and mildew. A thin layer of water covered the floor, reflecting the lantern's light in trembling ripples as we moved deeper into the belly of the Orpheus. At first, there was nothing but the creak of the timbers and the occasional bubble that broke the surface of the water. Then, just as Holmes halted to listen again, a flicker of movement passed before us, a shadow vanishing behind a row of rusted barrels. Holmes sprang forward, light cutting sharply across the bulkheads. "Hold where you are!" Lestrade barked, his revolver drawn. The shadow froze. A moment later, a man emerged slowly from the gloom, hands raised to shoulder height. His clothes were damp and torn, his face half concealed beneath a grimy kerchief. The lantern revealed a pair of pale eyes glinting with an animal brightness. "Well," Holmes said coolly, "the fisherman who casts his line in such waters must expect to catch strange company. Who are you, sir?" The man licked his cracked lips. "Name's Carrow," he muttered hoarsely. "Was foreman here years ago, under Sir Lysander. I meant no harm, just came to fetch what was mine." Holmes's gaze did not waver. "And what treasure could you possibly claim in a wreck that's half rotted and half drowned?" The man hesitated, his eyes darting toward a wooden crate half hidden beneath a tangle of chains. "Tools," he said. "Old things, nothing worth your notice." Holmes stepped past him, crouched, and brushed aside the chain. The crate was new, its edges unsoiled by rot, its brass hinges unstained by the years of damp. He tapped it lightly. "You are a poor liar, Mr. Carrow. This box has not been here a week, and judging by the traces on the lid, it was opened in haste. Allow me." He pried it open with the point of his knife. Inside lay a stack of papers, several sealed packets, and, most ominously, a small tin cylinder, the kind used for chemical fuses. Holmes examined it in silence, then gave a single nod. "Lestrade, I advise you to handle this man gently. He's no common thief, he's the cleaner of another's work. Tell me, Carrow, who sent you to erase what remains?" Carrow's mouth twisted, fear flickering beneath his bravado. "No one sent me, I swear it. I heard talk in Tilbury that the Orpheus was being watched again, that the yard was sniffing round old bones. I came to fetch my due, that's all." Holmes's voice softened, but his eyes did not. "And yet the only thing you've fetched is a charge of dynamite. You meant to destroy the wreck, just as Sir Lysander destroyed his ships. He died at dawn, and you return at night to make certain no dawn could expose him." Carrow's breath quickened. "I didn't light it. I swear I didn't light it." "Then perhaps you will be kind enough not to start now," Holmes said dryly, lifting the cylinder from the crate. "Watson, hold the lantern higher." The papers within the crate were sodden at the edges, but still legible. Holmes drew one out, a shipping manifest stamped with the Starkweather seal. Across its face ran a scrawl in thick black ink. "The bell will toll when the tide turns." Beneath it, in smaller hand, was another line. "Keep faith with M." Holmes's expression darkened. So our phantom M was not merely a correspondent, but an accomplice. The dawn, the tide, the bell, they are all of one pattern, Watson, the rhythm of guilt returning upon itself. From the deck above came the sudden splash of water, followed by the sharp creak of the rope at the side of the ship. Holmes's head snapped up. "He's here," he said, his voice low and quick. "The true hand that guides this affair." He thrust the fuse into my grasp and climbed the ladder with swift, silent strides. I followed, heart pounding. The mist outside had thickened to a near-solid shroud, muffling all sound save the whisper of the river. A faint glow flickered near the prow, another lantern, its shutter swinging loosely. Holmes moved toward it, every motion measured and soundless, and then a voice came from the fog, cold, composed, and unmistakably female. I warned him not to wake the dawn, but he would not listen. Mrs. Delane stood at the edge of the wreck, her dark cloak drawn tight, the river mist curling about her like smoke. In her hand she held something small and gleaming, a pistol. Lestrade gasped, "By heaven, madam, drop that!" But she did not move. Her eyes, when the lantern light caught them, were bright with anguish and resolve. "You don't understand," she said. "Lysander deserved to die. He ruined my husband, drove him to the sea, and called it charity when he drowned him with debt. I only meant to frighten him, to make him see what dawn truly meant to those he destroyed." Holmes regarded her with quiet intensity. "You constructed the mechanism in the Aurora?" "I showed him how," she whispered. "The blind, the light, the salt." He thought it was a test of courage, a symbol of forgiveness. I let him believe it, but I never touched him after that. He died by his own terror, by the truth he tried to hide. Her voice broke, and the pistol trembled. "When I learned he was dead, I came here to finish it, to burn what remained, to bury my shame along with his. Caro was to help me, but you—" Her gaze flicked between Holmes and Lestrade. "You were not meant to find it." Holmes took a slow step forward. "You have gone too far to undo what has been done, madam, but not so far that truth cannot be salvaged. You will come with us." She gave a small, hollow laugh. "And leave his sins for daylight to devour?" "No, Mr. Holmes, the dawn is not for me." Before anyone could move, she turned sharply and hurled the pistol into the river. The splash echoed like a bell tolling through the fog. Then she sank to her knees upon the deck, face hidden in her hands, the mist wrapping her in silence. Holmes stood over her for a long moment, the lantern light casting his features into deep shadow. "So ends the last voyage of the Orpheus," he said at last. "One man's deceit, one woman's vengeance, and the tide between them. There will be time enough for justice, Lestrade. For now, see that she is taken safely ashore." As the inspector signalled his men from the dock, Holmes turned once more toward the water. The fog had begun to lift slightly, and in the east, the first faint hue of dawn touched the horizon. He watched it for a long while, his expression unreadable. Then, with a sigh that carried both weariness and pity, he said softly, "At last, the room that waited for dawn has found its light." Holmes remained by the rail long after Lestrade's men had led Mrs. Delane away toward the waiting carriage. The mist was thinning now, dissolving into streaks of silver, as dawn finally pressed its pale fingers across the river. I stood a few feet behind him, uncertain whether his silence was one of satisfaction or melancholy. The faint sound of gulls drifted over the water, mingling with the slow creak of the Orpheus as it settled deeper into its muddy grave. At last he turned to me, his face lined with fatigue, but his eyes still sharp and alert. "Watson," he said, "you have observed throughout this case a pattern so deliberate, so symmetrical, that one might almost believe the hand of Providence was shaping it. But I do not trust symmetry. It is the favorite refuge of the criminal mind." I frowned, not fully grasping his meaning. "You think there is something yet unfinished?" "Unfinished?" He gave a dry laugh. "My dear fellow, this case has only shed one of its many skins. Did it not strike you as curious that Mrs. Delane, though so prepared to sacrifice herself, spoke not a word of how she gained access to Sir Lysander's mechanism, nor how she came into possession of his private blueprints for the Aurora suite? Those diagrams were never filed, never shared, yet she knew them in detail." She might have seen them among her husband's papers, I suggested. Holmes shook his head. The captain's estate was settled years before these arrangements were made. No, someone supplied her with the knowledge and with the chemicals that composed the fatal illusion of dawn. Lestrade rejoined us then, his coat flapping in the wind. She's being taken to the yard. I'll see to the formal statement later today. Sad business, Holmes, though I must say you handled her well. Still, justice is justice. Holmes gave him a brief nod. You are an admirable servant of procedure, Inspector, but sometimes justice lies not at the surface, but beneath the next layer of deceit. Tell me, was anyone else seen near the Aurora the night of Sir Lysander's death? Lestrade frowned. No one of importance, only the hotel manager, Hargreaves, and that waiter, Clegg, the one who brought the tray. Both were questioned and cleared. Why? Because, said Holmes quietly, the man who arranged the light could not have relied solely on Mrs. Delane's passion. The device required precision, the timing of the blind, the chemical mixture, the placement of the reflective paper. She had the motive, yes, but not the method. There was another hand guiding hers, and that hand, I fancy, still moves unseen. We returned to London that afternoon, the train carrying us through a grey haze of smoke and silence. Holmes spoke little, his eyes fixed on the window, as if tracing invisible diagrams upon the passing fields. When we arrived at Baker Street, he went immediately to his desk, spread out the papers from the Orpheus, and arranged them with surgical precision. There are too many coincidences, Watson, he said at last. The telegram sent from Tilbury signed M, the forged letter, instructing Carrow to destroy the evidence. The timing of our arrival all point to a mind alert, watchful, and still very much at work. I sat opposite him, watching as he compared the handwriting on the telegram with that on the manifests. You think this second mind, whoever it is, used Mrs. Delane as a pawn? Exactly so. She believed herself the instrument of retribution, but she was only a brush in another artist's hand. Someone sought to eliminate Sir Lysander, to ensure the Orpheus was silenced forever, and to cast suspicion upon the one person whose guilt would seem both credible and tragic. Holmes leaned closer to the papers, his thin fingers tracing a line of figures on the margin of one of the ledgers. Do you notice these recurring entries, Watson? Small sums deposited monthly, always under the name Hargreaves and Coalis. That name should be familiar. It belongs to the manager of the Aurora. I started. You think he... I think, said Holmes, that our self-effacing hotelier has been drawing a quiet income from Sir Lysander's shadow accounts for years. The Aurora was not merely a lodging house, it was a staging ground for transactions of a more delicate nature. It was the perfect site for his final performance. A knock interrupted us then, firm, deliberate. Mrs. Hudson entered, her expression tight. A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes, says it's urgent. Holmes glanced at me with a glint of irony. The play continues. The visitor was Mr. Hargreaves himself. His composure was practised, but the pallor beneath his neatly trimmed beard betrayed sleeplessness. Mr. Holmes, he began, I have come because I hear you have been to Tilbury. The police have taken poor Mrs. Delane into custody, and the hotel's name is being dragged into scandal. I must know, has she confessed to acting alone? Holmes regarded him with polite detachment. Confession is a curious word, Mr. Hargreaves. It implies guilt, and guilt implies motive. Tell me, what motive would you ascribe to her? Hargreaves hesitated. Revenge, surely. Everyone knew she blamed Sir Lysander for her misfortunes. Indeed, and yet revenge rarely troubles itself with ledgers and chemical compositions. You are a man of figures, Mr. Hargreaves. Your accounts must be precise. I have here certain payments that connect your name with Sir Lysander's private ventures. How do you explain them?" A bead of perspiration glimmered at his temple. "Bookkeeping," he said too quickly. "Routine expenses for the hotel." Holmes's smile was slight but merciless. "Then your hotel must have shipped quite a fleet. The sums coincide exactly with the insurance claims for the Orpheus and her sister vessels. You see, I think Sir Lysander required an accomplice ashore to certify the existence of ships that never sailed, someone with access to the necessary signatures and seals, a man of respectability and discretion. When the baronet feared exposure, he became a liability to his partner. The easiest way to silence him was to engineer a death both theatrical and plausible. Hargreaves had gone pale. "You can't prove that." Holmes's voice dropped to a silken whisper. "Can't I? The forged telegram from Tilbury bears your clerk's notation code, and Carrow was in your employ at the docks. You are a cautious man, Mr. Hargreaves, but even the cautious leave footprints when they walk through salt." The man's composure crumbled. He sank into the chair, his hands trembling. "He was going to ruin me," he muttered. He'd begun to suspect I was taking more than my share. He said he'd expose everything to the board, have me imprisoned. I only wanted him frightened, not dead. She, Mrs. Delane, she wanted him to suffer. I let her believe the mechanism was harmless. Holmes regarded him with a cold stillness that chilled even me. "You built the device?" "Yes," Hargreaves whispered. "I set it for dawn. I thought he'd faint, not die. But when I heard of his heart, I knew what I'd done." Holmes rose, and his voice held no triumph. "Then the dawn has taken you both, Mr. Hargreaves, one by death, the other by conscience. Lestrade shall hear your confession in the morning." As Hargreaves was led away, the first full light of day broke over Baker Street, flooding the room with gold. Holmes stood in it like a figure carved from shadow and fire. "Watson," he said softly, "it is a curious thing. Men chase the dawn for its promise of clarity, yet it blinds them all the same." And for a moment, as I watched him turn back to his desk, I could not tell whether he spoke of the dead, the guilty, or himself. The day after Hargreaves' confession dawned, with a brittle stillness over Baker Street, the sort of silence that comes not from peace but from exhaustion. Holmes had been awake all night. I could hear him pacing long after I retired, the low scratch of pen against paper, and the occasional strike of a match to relight his pipe. When I entered the sitting-room the next morning, the fire had burned low, and Holmes was seated at his desk, the morning edition of the Times spread before him. "They have printed it already," he said without looking up. "Baronet's death," explained, "romantic tragedy at the Aurora Hotel." They reduce 3 deaths of the spirit and 1 of the body into a headline fit for gossip over breakfast. It is always thus when art meets journalism. I glanced at the article. Lestrade's report was quoted liberally, the words "conspiracy of fraud and revenge" standing out in bold print. "At least the truth is known," I ventured. Holmes's eyes flicked up, sharply. "Known, Watson. A convenient portion of it, perhaps. Truth, my dear fellow, is rarely content to be parcelled out like a railway timetable." He folded the paper with deliberate care. "There are threads yet unknotted. Hargreaves confessed to building the device, yes, but not to sending the telegram nor to ensuring Carrow's silence. He may have forged instruments, but someone else played them." Before I could answer, a light tap sounded at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, carrying a small parcel wrapped in plain brown paper. "This came by special messenger, sir. No name, only your address." Holmes's interest sharpened instantly. He took the parcel, examined the paper without opening it, then held it near the lamp. No watermark. The twine is of course hemp, dockyard issue. Whoever sent this has ties to the river. He sliced it open with his penknife. Inside was a small glass vial, sealed with red wax. Around its neck was tied a folded scrap of paper bearing 3 words, written in a hand I recognized at once. "The bell tolls." Holmes's expression grew taut. "You recall the message on the manifest in the Orpheus crate, Watson. The bell will toll when the tide turns." The same phrase, repeated like an echo. He turned the vial over in his fingers. Within, the liquid shimmered faintly blue beneath the light. "I suspect this is not ink." He rose abruptly, crossing to his chemical table, where he unsealed the vial and decanted a drop into a shallow dish. A faint hiss sounded as it met the air, releasing a thin ribbon of pale vapour. Holmes inhaled cautiously, then nodded. "As I thought. Hydrogen cyanide in diluted form, masked with iodine. A subtle death for an unsubtle warning. The sender knows precisely what they are doing." I felt a chill run through me. "But who would dare threaten you, Holmes, after all that's come to light?" "Someone for whom light itself is the danger," he replied. "The bell? Always the bell. It may refer not to sound, but to a place." He crossed to the cabinet and withdrew a map of the Thames. "Here, just east of Tilbury, Bell Wharf, long disused. Once a refitting station for small cargo vessels. If Hargreaves or Carrow ever conducted their dealings away from the hotel, that is where their partners would have met them." Without another word, he snatched his coat and hat. "Fetch your revolver, Watson. The dawn has told us its story. Now we must listen for the bell." The journey back to Tilbury was a grim one. The sky was low and grey, the air heavy with the metallic taste of coming rain. We hired a local cab to take us as near to Bell Wharf as the road allowed, then continued on foot. The path wound through a stretch of marshland, the reeds whispering like conspirators in the wind. The wharf itself was a desolation, half-sunken pilings, the skeletons of old boats, and a single warehouse leaning toward collapse. Holmes moved ahead with his lantern, examining the ground with swift, bird-like glances. "Recent footprints," he murmured. 2 men, one heavy-set, one lighter, both moving with haste, and here the imprint of a cane. He knelt to touch the mark. Rounded end, ivory tip. That, Watson, is no common accessory. It belongs to a man of refinement, or of affectation. Do you recall Sir Lysander's nephew, Reginald Starkweather? The disinherited one mentioned by Lestrade? I have reason to believe he was not so disinherited as reported. We entered the warehouse, the lantern casting long, wavering shadows. The floor was littered with broken crates and the skeletal remains of machinery. Near the centre stood a table, upon which lay a small brass instrument shaped like a miniature bell, its clapper missing. Beside it rested a sheaf of papers weighted by a single coin. Holmes lifted the coin, a gold sovereign, and studied the inscription. "Minted this year," he murmured. "Fresh from circulation. The ink on these papers is scarcely dry." He scanned the first page, then handed it to me. It was a letter of credit drawn in the name of Reginald Starkweather, signed by Hargreaves, witnessed by one J. Carrow. "Good heavens," I said. "He financed the fraud himself." Holmes smiled grimly. "Precisely. The nephew orchestrated the scheme and used his uncle's name to secure the investments. When discovery loomed, he arranged to let the old man bear the full weight of the crime and ensured his silence with that fatal illusion at the Aurora. Hargreaves was a tool, Mrs. Delane the unwitting blade, and Reginald the hand that wielded both. A sudden sound interrupted him, the crunch of gravel outside. Holmes doused the lantern instantly and motioned for silence. Through the cracks in the boards I saw a flicker of light moving along the path, a lantern beam swaying with an uncertain rhythm. Holmes whispered, "He returns for the final stroke, to recover what remains of his fortune." The footsteps entered the warehouse, cautious but steady. The beam fell upon the table, lingered on the bell-shaped device, and then lifted toward the shadows where we waited. Holmes sprang forward, seizing the man by the wrist. There was a short struggle, a cry of pain, and then the lantern crashed to the ground, spilling light across Reginald Starkweather's face. "Release me," he spat, his voice shaking. "You've no right." "No right," Holmes said coldly. "You murdered your uncle with your contrivance, deceived your accomplices, and now send poison by post to conceal your trail. The bell tolls for you, Mr. Starkweather." The man sagged in defeat, his composure draining away. "He was going to ruin me," he muttered. "He found the forged accounts. I only meant to frighten him. The heart was weak. How was I to know it would stop?" Holmes's eyes softened for a fleeting moment. "The heart stops, sir, but conscience does not. It will haunt you long after the rope has done its work." Outside, the rain began to fall, striking the river in rhythmic measure, as though answering an invisible bell. And as Lestrade's men led the trembling figure away, Holmes stood at the threshold of the ruin, his silhouette stark against the lightening sky. "The room waited for dawn," he murmured. But it was the bell that tolled at last. The rain fell harder as we left Bell Wharf. The narrow road back to Tilbury drowned beneath the steady hiss of water upon stone. Holmes walked ahead of me, his collar turned high and his pace unrelenting, his mind clearly far from the miserable weather. The case, I knew, had not yet finished unfolding, not in the mechanical sense of a solved crime, but in that deeper and more personal realm where justice, morality, and human frailty intertwined. "Watson," he said suddenly without turning, "do you recall what Reginald Starkweather said when I confronted him? That he only meant to frighten his uncle." "Yes. He insisted the death was unintentional." "Precisely, and that, I think, may prove to be the final deceit. His words were calculated not for truth but for sympathy. Reginald's kind always leave one thread uncut, the vanity of their own intellect." We reached the station just as the train whistle cried through the mist. By the time we settled into our compartment, the landscape had become a smear of grey through the window, punctuated now and then by the silhouettes of telegraph poles. Holmes sat opposite me, silent for several miles, his gaze fixed upon some inward vision. At last, he spoke. "I have sent a wire to Lestrade instructing him to have the remaining records at Bell Wharf impounded. There is a missing account ledger, one that does not appear in the chest we found aboard the Orpheus." Reginald mentioned nothing of it, yet he had reason to fear it. That ledger, Watson, may hold the evidence not merely of fraud, but of murder by design. I looked up sharply. "You mean he engineered the entire mechanism to kill?" "Unquestionably. Consider the precision of the chemical reaction, the timed release of light and gas, the position of the desk. It was too perfect to be coincidence. Mrs. Delane's emotional confession was convenient for him, and Hargreaves' greed completed the illusion. But the intellect behind it belonged to the nephew. He orchestrated each move, then retreated behind their guilt like a general behind his lines." The rhythmic clatter of the train wheels filled the pause that followed. I watched him closely, struck again by the restless energy that lived within his stillness. "You seem almost unsettled, Holmes," I ventured. "The case is concluded, the culprit in custody. What remains to disturb you?" He exhaled a thin stream of smoke, the faintest hint of melancholy in his voice. "Watson, I have long accepted that the intellect, when ungoverned by conscience, can produce horrors far greater than passion ever could. This case has merely confirmed it. To construct a mechanism of death as elegantly as one might compose a sonnet, it is both genius and monstrosity in the same breath. I could think of no reply, and for the rest of the journey we rode in silence. When we returned to Baker Street, the lamps were already lit and the fire had been rekindled. Mrs. Hudson met us at the door with a telegram in hand. Holmes tore it open without a word, and I saw his expression tighten as he read. "Lestrade has searched the Wharf warehouse," he said. "The missing ledger was not there, but he found something else, a set of blueprints bearing the Starkweather seal, and beside them an unfinished letter addressed to R. It appears someone else had a hand in these events after all." He laid the telegram on the table. "The letter was signed L.S., but it cannot be the late Sir Lysander himself. The writing is recent, perhaps 2 days old." "But how can that be?" I exclaimed. "Sir Lysander is dead beyond doubt." "Just so," Holmes murmured, and in his tone was that peculiar mixture of satisfaction and dread that I had come to recognize whenever a mystery deepened at the very moment it seemed resolved. "Yet his signature has reappeared, and that, my dear Watson, suggests a hand willing to resurrect even the dead if it serves his purpose." He rose abruptly, crossed to his violin, and drew the bow across the strings in a slow, resonant note that seemed to fill the entire room with thought. "We must return to the Aurora tonight. The pattern is not complete. There remains an unseen player, one who has watched from the wings since the first act." Despite my protest at the hour, Holmes's insistence admitted no argument. Within the hour we were once more in a cab rattling through the gaslit streets toward the Strand. The Aurora loomed out of the fog like a ghost from its own past. The manager's office stood locked, but Holmes produced the duplicate key Lestrade had left in his care and entered silently. The corridors were dim, the silence almost reverent. We ascended to the second floor, to the same east-facing suite where Sir Lysander had met his end. Holmes paused before the door, his hand resting upon the brass knob. "Observe, Watson, the lock has been changed." He took out his magnifying lens, examined the plate, and smiled grimly. "Hargreaves may be imprisoned, but someone else has taken precautions. Step lightly." Inside, the room was as it had been on that dreadful morning, save that the broken blind had been replaced, and the air smelled faintly of polish and fresh paint. But as Holmes moved toward the desk, his foot brushed something small and metallic that rolled across the carpet. He bent and retrieved it, a cufflink, engraved with the same initials, R.S. He held it up to the lamplight. "Our phantom returns to the scene of his masterpiece. Reginald Starkweather may sit in custody, but the true intelligence behind his scheme walks free. This trinket, Watson, was placed here deliberately, too easily found. A message, perhaps, or a summons." I felt a chill. "A summons? For whom?" "For me," Holmes said softly. "He wishes me to come, and I shall oblige him." He turned to the window, where the pale glow of the street lamps flickered through the fog. For a moment, the two of us stood in that haunted room where death had once waited for dawn, and I could not help but feel that something or someone was watching us from the shadows beyond the glass. Holmes drew the curtain closed. "The bell has tolled, Watson," he said quietly, "but I fear it has not yet struck its final note." We left the Aurora in silence, the city strangely hushed about us, as though the whole of London were holding its breath. And as we walked back through the wet streets toward Baker Street, I could not shake the sense that our adversary, this unseen architect who manipulated guilt, greed, and vengeance alike, was still very much awake, waiting for the next dawn that Holmes himself had unknowingly promised. Holmes's silence on the ride back from the Aurora was not of weariness but of arrangement. I had come to recognize that particular stillness. It was the hush in a theatre before the curtain lifts, when every pulley is set and the rope tenders wait on a single cue. When we reached Baker Street, he wrote 3 notes in rapid succession, dispatched one by boy to Lestrade, another to the Times, and the third to a discreet chemist off the Strand, then turned to me with that glitter in his eye which foretold action. "We will borrow the enemy's instrument and make it play our tune," said he. "The city shall learn before nightfall that the missing ledger has been recovered and will be placed, for the sake of formal inventory, in the same chamber where Sir Lysander died. Dawn, Watson, announce dawn, and the architect of this cruel stage will not resist another performance." "You mean to bait him with the Aurora's room?" I exclaimed. "With the Aurora's room and his own conceit," he replied. "The cuff-link was not lost, it was laid, so be it. We shall show him a stage dressed to his fancy and see with what hand he reaches for the curtain." By 8 o'clock that evening, the late edition of the Times carried a small notice, no more than a paragraph, which stated with official vagueness that certain documents pertaining to the Starkweather accounts had been placed under police seal, and were to be inventoried at the Aurora at sunrise in the presence of the authorities. Lestrade, grumbling that he was made as much stage manager as policeman, agreed nevertheless to post men outside and out of sight, leaving the interior to Holmes's discretion. Our chemist arrived like a conspirator, and in our sitting-room Holmes contrived a harmless facsimile of the original flash. Chalk cut fine for salt, magnesia replaced by plaster, the whole a mere puff in air, enough to startle, to signal but incapable of harm. He worked with the fastidious delight of a craftsman correcting a vulgar copy. We reached the Aurora after midnight. The corridors were hush as cloisters. The gas cast a monkish glow upon the carpet-runner. In number 26 the blind had been rehung, the cleat shone, the window frame smelled faintly of fresh varnish, where the workman had smoothed away the memory of that broken slat. Holmes moved about with a practised economy, his long fingers tightening a knot here, slackening a cord there, eyes flicking from window to opposite wall as one who reads a familiar score. Upon the desk he set the bait, a ledger bound in calf, the Starkweather seal impressed on a blob of convincing wax. Within, its leaves were blank. "You will keep to the alcove, Watson," he murmured, indicating the velvet drape beside the mantel. "If he is the man I believe, he will first test the room, then the desk, then the window. He will rely on habit. Habit will betray him. When he steps between the desk and the window, the toy sunrise will oblige us with our cue." "And our adversary?" I asked. "You have a name for those initials on the cuff-link?" Holmes's mouth made its fine, sardonic line. "Rufus Selby, solicitor to the Starkweather estate, draftsman of letters of credit and custodian of seals. He had the art to forge the late baronet's hand for a posthumous instruction, the discretion to move funds behind hotel curtains, and the vanity to toll a bell for his own cleverness. The nephew blustered and spent. Hargreaves tinkered. Mrs. Delane bled. But a solicitor, Watson, there is a profession in which men learn to make other hands do their work." We doused the lamp and took our positions. The minutes slid like beads. The noises of the hotel thinned to nothing. Even the tick of the mantel clock seemed to sink into the thick, velvet dark. I counted 3/4 in my head and had reached the long patience which is half a soldier's trade when the latch gave the faintest sigh. Holmes's hand, black against the shadow, stilled me. The door eased inward an inch, 2 inches, then opened wide enough to admit a man who brought his knight with him. He shut it behind him without a click, felt along the panel for the key, and pocketed it. There was the softest tap of a cane upon carpet. 2 points, one of rubber, one of ivory, and a folded shade lamp woke in his hand, revealing no more than his gloves and the neat bow of his tie. He stood and listened as if his ears had whiskers. He crossed to the desk, passed the beam over the ledger, and did not touch it. Instead, he went to the window and drew the blind down 3 inches, tugged the cord with a professional finger, and nodded to himself. He returned to the desk, and with the ease of long practice, produced a little brass device from his pocket, shaped like a bell without a clapper. He set it upon the sill and cocked a tiny lever. A thread ran from it to the cleat, so fine as to be air. He was remaking his dawn. The lamp drifted to the wall opposite, where the fool's cap hung again at Holmes's insistence. A ghost of a smile crossed the lower half of his face. Holmes stepped from the dark with a quietness that startled even me. "Mr. Selby," said he in that most courteous of his tones, "be so good as to leave your instrument precisely where it is. We shall prefer to see it in action on this occasion." The hand with the lamp did not tremble, it merely paused. "Mr. Holmes," said a voice as colourless and dry as a docket, "your notoriety precedes you. I congratulate you on your industry with the press." "The press obliges those who oblige it," returned Holmes. "Permit me to restore a symmetry which your first arrangement lacked. You brought a device and a letter. Tonight, we supply the letter and the device. The difference is that ours will not kill." "Kill?" he echoed. "An ugly word, Mr. Holmes. I am a man of papers." "Papers sent to Tilbury, to Bell Wharf, to a clerk with a code, papers whose seals you held and whose signatures you manufactured, papers that offered dawn to a frightened man and poison to those who asked questions. Your cufflink was overplaying your hand, Mr. Selby. Vanity, always the undoing of a tidy mind." The man's lamp lifted a fraction, and I saw the thin, capable mouth harden. "You overrate your drama. Shall we call for the police and spare ourselves the rhetoric?" "By all means," said Holmes pleasantly. "But first, indulge me. Stand, if you please, between the desk and the window." He made a fractional movement as if to refuse. Then, with the contempt of the practiced manipulator for the intelligences he has too long used, he complied. In the same breath, Holmes's finger found the prepared cleat. There was a crisp whisper of cord, the blind leapt, and the harmless flare that he had concocted blossomed with a snow-white puff. Selby's face turned sharply toward it, his hand going not to his eyes, but to his pocket, swift, precise, revealing. Holmes was faster. His grip closed upon the wrist. Something small and glassy fell and spun on the carpet with a brittle singing. I stamped it flat, the twin of the vial we had received by post. "Hydrocyanic," Holmes said softly. "For Lestrade, perhaps, or for me, should conscience prove too slow a hangman. Your bell without a clapper is a neat improvement. A spark timed to a thread, a flash to fix the eye, and then an inhalation. A gentleman dies of syncope at dawn. A solicitor watches the tide carry away all that cannot be signed." Selby's composure broke with a dry snap. "The old fool would have ruined us all," he hissed. He had begun to speak, to write. Reginald was reckless, Hargreaves a glutton. Someone had to keep the pattern straight. "And so you kept it, beautifully, until you could not resist inviting applause," said Holmes. He released the wrist and stepped back. The door opened as if on cue. Lestrade entered with 2 men, his bulldog jaw set and his eyes alight. "We heard enough," he said shortly. "Mr. Rufus Selby, I arrest you on suspicion of murder and conspiracy to defraud." Selby looked not at Lestrade, but at the blank foolscap on the wall, as if seeking there the diagram that had always justified him. "You have no proof," he said. but the dryness had gone from his voice. It rasped now like torn paper. Holmes gestured to the sill, the device, the crushed vial, the thread, still humming faintly from the blind's recoil. "On the contrary, you have left us a room of proofs, a room that waits for dawn, Mr. Selby, and dawn is not kind to ink." They took him away without struggle. When the door had closed, Holmes crossed to the window and raised the blind fully. The east was paling. The first clean line of morning drew itself along the cornice as if an unseen hand had at last completed a long, exacting figure. He stood in it a moment, the light along his cheekbone, then turned to me with a gentleness that always surprised me after his severest exertions. "You see, Watson," he said, "it is not the dawn that kills, it is the man who thinks himself its author." And as the city woke beyond the Strand, I felt, for the first time since Sir Lysander's door had kept its fatal vow, that we had reached the threshold where explanation would soon begin. The following morning, London lay under a thin veil of mist, that soft grey haze which turns the river to pewter, and the domes of the city into spectres. Holmes sat by the window, a cigarette between his fingers, the residue of the night's triumph still flickering faintly in his eyes. Lestrade had come early to deliver his report. Rufus Selby had made a full confession before dawn, the precision of which astonished even the inspector. The solicitor had laid bare the entire mechanism of deceit, the forged contracts, the false ship ledgers, and finally the carefully constructed illusion of light that turned the Aurora Hotel into an execution chamber. When Lestrade had gone, leaving behind his usual mix of gratitude and bewilderment, Holmes rose and began to walk, slow and deliberate, across the room. His manner was not of victory, but of meditation. I waited, knowing better than to intrude upon that inward discourse which so often followed his greatest successes. At last he stopped before the fireplace, his gaze fixed upon the faint glow of embers. "It is finished," I said softly. "Finished?" he repeated, and there was a distant irony in his tone. "The case, yes, the machinery has ceased to turn. But what of the hand that set it in motion, the mind that conceived it? Every man who died in this affair, Starkweather, Hargreaves, even poor Mrs. Delane, was a cog in Selby's design, yet he believed himself only an administrator tidying disorder. Tell me, Watson, is there a more dangerous criminal than the one who mistakes his crimes for housekeeping? I could only shake my head. He was a cold one, Holmes, colder than most I have seen you face. He smiled faintly. Cold, yes, but not unique. You see, intellect divorced from moral sense is like a lantern without a chimney. It burns fiercely for a moment and then suffocates itself. Selby's vanity was his oxygen. When he sent that cufflink, he was already gasping for admiration. He wanted not merely to succeed, but to be recognized for his cleverness. In that he signed his own death warrant. He moved to the window then, pushing it open so that the damp morning air entered, smelling faintly of rain and coal smoke. Outside, a newspaper boy was crying the headline, "Thames Solicitor Confesses to Dawn Murder." Holmes watched the lad vanish into the fog, then turned to me with a look half weary, half amused. "Lestrade will have his commendation, Scotland Yard its statistics, and the public its sensation," he said. "Yet I confess, the part that lingers with me is not the crime, but the symbol of it. A room that waited for dawn. What an allegory, Watson! Each of them waited, did they not? The baronet for his false redemption, the woman for her vengeance, the clerk for his profit, the solicitor for his perfection. And dawn, when it came, showed them only themselves." He stood there a moment, the smoke curling upward from his cigarette, the faint light tracing the sharp outline of his face. Then, as if some inner tension at last released, he turned back toward the fire and dropped the cigarette into the grate. "There is one mercy in these tangled human tragedies," he said. "They end. The pattern closes, the dust settles, and even the cleverest of men cannot alter the rising of the sun. In that sense, Watson, dawn is the only detective greater than I." His eyes twinkled at the jest, and I could not help but smile. "You forget, Holmes, that dawn has no chronicler." He inclined his head with mock gravity. "Then I must rely on you to continue the partnership. Let us hope, however, that the next dawn we greet will not require a coroner's signature." We breakfasted quietly, the rain soft upon the panes, the fire steady. By noon the mist had lifted, and London resumed its eternal rhythm, the carriages rumbling, the vendors calling, the life of the great city indifferent once more to tragedy. Holmes had already taken up his violin and was drawing from it one of those strange, meditative airs that seem to fold the whole world into a single, thoughtful chord. I turned the pages of my notes, my pen pausing as I wrote the last line. The case of the room that waited for dawn would soon join the others in my locked drawer, a record of human frailty laid bare by a mind that saw beyond the smoke of deception to the cold machinery beneath. And yet, as I closed the notebook, I could not help but glance toward my friend, whose music rose like a question that could never quite be answered. "Holmes," I said suddenly, "so do you ever tire of it, the endless chase, the unmasking, the ugliness beneath it all?" He did not pause in his playing, but a smile touched his lips. "My dear Watson," he said softly, "the world is full of darkness, but the chase, the chase, that is the light we kindle against it." The bower swept one last lingering note across the strings, pure and high as morning. And as the sound faded into the quiet of Baker Street, I thought again of that lonely room in the Aurora Hotel, where a man had waited for dawn, and of another, brighter dawn that now broke upon the mind of Sherlock Holmes, who never waited for light, but made it.